The story of Tamar is one that, if we're honest, most of us would skip over because it makes for very uncomfortable reading and cannot be explained easily. That Tamar appears in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus might be a mystery to some, but Clements, in her book Mothers on the Margin, argues that it resonates with Matthew's gospel on three levels. First, a reversal of expectation, where we find an outsider is shown to respond in more appropriate ways in the aspects of faith. Two, it highlights the contribution of someone who is structurally and culturally marginalized. And three, it brings to the foreground the role of women in the purposes of God. If we read through Matthew's gospel, we see those three areas clearly through the ways in which Jesus interacted with those around him. But what of Tamar? What can we learn from such a complicated and difficult story? I want to suggest that we learn from Tamar the cost of justice seeking, excuse me, as well as what righteousness looks like from a disadvantaged viewpoint. But first, let's take a brief look at what actually happened. Tamar's story begins with Judah's story in Genesis 38, which is quite fitting considering the ending. We are told that Judah marries, has three sons, the eldest one being the husband of Tamar. We are not given details about Er's behavior, apart from being told that he was wicked. So God took his life. We won't go into whether it was Er's wickedness that caused his death, as in he might have been doing something dodgy, or did God actually kill him? But perhaps you might want to discuss this with others at some point later. However, let's continue with Tamar's story. According to the laws at the time, when a husband dies without leaving an heir, his widow was given to his closest of kin, and in this case, Er's brother Onan, so that an heir could be birthed and the husband's line continue. This was known as levirate marriage and was a common practice in societies where there was a strong clan culture. But that was also a way of protecting the woman, because then a woman belonged first to her father and then to her husband. Furthermore, the woman could not inherit anything following her husband's death, and therefore having children, particularly having a son, was a way in which she could be taken care of. It is significant for us to note here that the early church was admonished to look after widows. So as a society, then and now, we have a duty of care. And we see that in 1 Timothy 5, verse 3 to 4. So let's continue with the story. Unfortunately, Onan, Er's brother, who was given to Tamar, did not like the arrangement because he did not want to father his brother's heir. And despite going along with the benefits of having a wife, did the unthinkable. He spilled his seed, which meant that Tamar could not and did not get pregnant. Again, we are told that God intervenes because of this wickedness that Onan did, and Judah loses his second son. At this point, Judah's third son, Shelah, is not old enough to be married. So Tamar is sent back to her father's household with the promise from Judah that she would be wedded to Shelah when he became of age. But Judah had no intention of following up on that promise. Are you keeping up so far? This is quite a lot. This surely is one of those soap storylines akin to EastEnders or the American soap opera The Bold and the Beautiful. So anyway, eventually, Judah's wife dies, and after the mourning period, he travels to Timnah, and Tamar hears of this, which brings us to what happens next. Tamar, by then, realizes that Judah had no intention of giving Shelah, even though he had come of age, and so she puts into action a plan of her own to safeguard her future. I mentioned earlier that we would look at justice seeking and righteousness in the context of being a disadvantaged person or people. And here we have it. Because of the way in which Tamar has been handled, lied to, put to a disadvantage, she herself devised a plan out of sheer desperation and a desire to survive in a society that disregarded her as a widow, a childless one at that. And here we have a situation where she disguises herself as a prostitute and waits for Judah. And sure enough, she gets him to acknowledge her. But this acknowledgement is not what Tamar would have preferred. She would have much rather Judah kept his promise and given her shelter and do the right thing. But she felt she was left with no other alternative that would be beneficial to her. And this is what I mean by justice seeking from a place of disadvantage. We see that in society today, where people on the margins, weighted down by poverty, resort to drastic measures in order to safeguard their well-being. How many of us can forget the image of the refugee child being carried out of the sea following the dreadful plight as his family attempted to seek a better life? How many of us have commented in disgust at people we consider to be benefit scroungers, or the person living on the street who resorts to drugs or alcohol? Now, I'm not condemning the use of drugs or alcohol abuse. What I am saying is that, like Judah, our systems and sometimes we ourselves have contributed in part to the demise of some members of our society. Who are the Tamars that we are forcing into taking risky chances just so they could make a life for themselves? Sure, Tamar, in a sense, you could call it that, tricked Judah. But Clement points to another book written by Nidich, which is a prelude to biblical folklore, in which the writer likens this trickery as a form of wisdom. And Clements also quotes Prauser in the book, Truth About Women, who argues that deception is a justifiable weapon to enable disadvantaged and less powerful people to gain justice. Now, that's quite a powerful statement. Deception is a justifiable weapon to enable disadvantaged and less powerful people to gain justice. And I'm sure if we look through history, we can most certainly find examples of this. So what happens next? Well, sure enough, Tamar gets pregnant. Judah hears of this and is outraged, and he orders that she be burned, because that's what happened. Because after all, a widow becoming pregnant meant that this happened through unscrupulous means. And in Tamar's society, this type of behavior was more than frowned upon. It was unacceptable and had severe consequences: death. It is interesting to read Judah's response to Tamar prostituting herself when he himself showed no such morality or concern when he approached who he thought was a prostitute. But that's how we are as human beings, quick to point out what others are doing wrong, yet not so quick to deal with our own flaws and wrongdoings. From here on, the story gets more interesting because Tamar had prepared for such an eventuality. And she'd asked for proof from Judah that he would give her the goat as payment, which was promised when they made the deal. It is at this point that Judah takes responsibility, because Tamar had proof that he indeed was the one who had fathered this child with which she was pregnant. And so he takes responsibility not only for his actions of sleeping with a prostitute, but his unwillingness and avoidance in doing what the law required by giving his third son to Tamar. And so, in an interesting twist worthy of a Hollywood film, Judah points to the righteousness of Tamar. So what are we to make of this righteousness as mentioned in the text? Now, Clements considers being righteous as behaving in a way that is appropriate to others in fulfilling requirements and obligations of a particular relationship. In other words, we are righteous within the framework of the relationships we find ourselves in. We cannot be righteous in isolation. We do that in community with those that we are linked with. And in that respect, Judah proved to be unrighteous because he did not fulfill his obligations to Tamar, while Tamar is seen as righteous or as acting rightly because she made choices not solely for her benefit, but in honor of her deceased husband to continue his genetic line. As social beings, righteousness is imperative if we are to live in harmony with each other and according to God's standards. It is within this context of trickery and desperate behavior that we find the lineage of Jesus, spearheaded by strong women placed in almost impossible situations that cause them to take extreme risk to procure the livelihood of future generations. It is no wonder that throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus befriending the marginalized and embracing the women as rightful heirs of the kingdom. Jesus himself is the embodiment of the justice seeking and righteousness we see exemplified by Tamar, and we would do well to learn from both. And so, over to us. Where are the places and situations that may require us to act in wisdom trickery so that justice can be gained and righteousness fulfilled? I want to suggest that those situations and events might be closer to us than we may think. Amen.